The story of the Weston family begins with the hope and excitement that comes with a fresh start. After experiencing painful bullying in their previous school, Malik and Jasmine Weston believe they found the perfect place for their daughter, Amora, to thrive. BMF Elementary, nestled in a progressive and diverse neighborhood, offers everything they had dreamed of, an elite school where Amora can grow academically, socially, and emotionally. As proud parents, they eagerly attend a parent-teacher conference, filled with pride as they learn of Amora's exceptional achievements. But what begins as a reassuring visit quickly transforms into a chilling discovery that will forever change the family's perception of their safe haven. In an environment they thought was nurturing and inclusive, Malik and Jasmine will face an unimaginable betrayal, one that threatens their faith in the very institution they believed would provide their daughter with the future she deserved. Weston Family and BMF Elementary. The Weston family, led by Malik and Jasmine, had always dreamed of providing their daughter, Amora, with the best opportunities in life. Coming from a modest background, they had worked tirelessly to build a life where their only child could excel in every aspect of her development. After years of living in a neighborhood that had been less than kind, filled with judgment and prejudice, the family decided it was time to move. They longed for a fresh start in a place where Amora could flourish without the weight of discrimination holding her back. When the opportunity arose to move to a progressive, diverse neighborhood, it felt like a dream come true. The school district was renowned for its high academic standards and strong emphasis on inclusivity, and BMF Elementary School stood out as a beacon of excellence. The Westons had visited the neighborhood a few times before making their decision, and it felt right. The streets were lined with vibrant homes, families of various backgrounds, and a sense of community that they had longed for. They hoped that BMF Elementary would not only provide Amora with the academic challenge she needed, but also offer her a space where she could grow emotionally and socially without the constraints of racism or prejudice. As they settled into their new home, they couldn't help but feel a sense of relief. The tension they had felt in their previous neighborhood, where subtle and not-so-subtle forms of discrimination were common, was gone. For the first time in years, they felt safe. They were excited to see Amora immerse herself in a school where she would be surrounded by children of different cultures, where her individuality would be celebrated. Malik, who had always been fiercely protective of Amora, felt that this move was the best decision they could have made for her future. Amora, on the other hand, was both nervous and excited. At 10 years old, she had already been through a lot. The bullying incident at her old school, which had targeted her because of her race, had shaken her confidence. Her parents, aware of the emotional scars the bullying had left behind, were determined to ensure she felt supported in her new school. They reassured her constantly that this was a fresh start, a chance to find new friends and excel without fear. Although Amora was a bright, compassionate girl, she had struggled with the weight of that bullying, and Malik and Jasmine knew that time, patience, and a welcoming environment would help her heal. The first day at BMF Elementary was filled with anticipation. Malik and Jasmine walked her to school, eager to see their daughter take her first steps into a new chapter. They were met by smiling faces, welcoming teachers, and a sense of unity that felt genuine. The warm greetings and the excitement in the air made it clear that this was a place where every child mattered. The school's commitment to diversity was evident in the artwork displayed throughout the hallways, showcasing the wide variety of backgrounds and cultures represented in the student body. To Malik and Jasmine, this was exactly what they had been searching for, a place where Amora could not only learn but thrive in an environment that encouraged her to be herself. As the weeks passed, Amora settled into her new routine. She made new friends and quickly found her place in the classroom. The teachers were kind and attentive, and the curriculum challenged her in all the right ways. She was excelling in her studies, particularly in math and reading, subjects she had always excelled in. But more than that, she was beginning to rediscover the joy of learning, something that had been lost to her in the aftermath of the bullying at her old school. Amora's natural leadership abilities began to shine through as she took on roles in group activities and helped her classmates when they struggled with lessons. Malik and Jasmine were overjoyed by the progress Amora was making and the happiness they saw in her every day. It was a routine that seemed perfect, a reality they had worked hard to achieve. For Malik and Jasmine, this was the life they had always dreamed of for their daughter, a nurturing school, a supportive community, and a future full of promise. They were hopeful that Amora would continue to thrive in this new environment, free from the worries that had once plagued her. However, in the midst of this seemingly idyllic picture, there was a growing sense of unease that neither Malik nor Jasmine could quite identify. They had hoped, even expected, that this move would be a fresh start in every sense of the word, and for a time, it seemed to be. But little did they know that the change in their daughter's life was only beginning, and it would soon take a turn that none of them could have predicted. The peaceful life they had envisioned was about to be shaken, and their trust in the very school they had chosen for their daughter would be tested in a way that would challenge everything they had believed about this progressive, inclusive community. Parent-teacher conference with Mrs. Thompson. The excitement and optimism that Malik and Jasmine had felt on their first days in the new neighborhood were brought to full fruition during the parent-teacher conference at BMF Elementary. This annual event was something the Westons had eagerly anticipated, and it was no ordinary meeting for them. It felt like the moment when all their hopes for Amora's future would be confirmed. As they stepped into the familiar halls of the school, the walls adorned with children's artwork, they were greeted by a sense of warmth that made them feel at ease. Each painting, each drawing, each piece of work showcased the talents of the children, providing a snapshot of the kind of environment that BMF Elementary fostered. The school was not just a place for academic growth, but one where creativity and individuality were celebrated. Malik and Jasmine felt their hearts swell with pride as they walked toward Amora's current classroom. It was a space that had nurtured her intellect and creativity, and both parents were eager to hear how their daughter had been performing under the guidance of her current teacher, Mrs. Thompson. They entered the classroom and were immediately met with the welcoming smile of Mrs. Thompson, a seasoned educator who had built a reputation at the school for her passion and dedication. Mrs. Thompson's warm demeanor put both parents at ease right away. Mr. and Mrs. Weston, Mrs. Thompson greeted them enthusiastically. "It's such a pleasure to meet with you again. Amora has been a joy to have in my class. I can't tell you enough how impressed I am with her work this year." The couple exchanged pleased smiles as Mrs. Thompson began to shuffle through the papers on her desk. As she pulled out Amora's assignments, Malik and Jasmine felt a sense of validation. Their daughter was doing exactly as they had hoped, excelling academically while embracing the challenges presented to her. Mrs. Thompson placed a series of papers in front of them, showcasing Amora's accomplishments. The neatness of her handwriting, the logical approach to math problems, the deep comprehension of her reading materials, everything was a testament to the hard work that Amora had put into her studies. But it wasn't just Amora's academic performance that Mrs. Thompson was proud of. She went on to describe how Amora stood out as a natural leader in the classroom. "She's not just an excellent student," Mrs. Thompson said, her voice filled with admiration. "She's an inspiration to the other children. During group activities, they just gravitate toward her. She leads by example, always helping others and pushing herself to do better." Malik and Jasmine exchanged glances, their hearts swelling with pride. They had always known that Amora was special, and it was rewarding to see that her teacher recognized the same qualities they admired in their daughter. Amora's kindness toward her classmates, her ability to collaborate, and her constant drive to improve, these traits were all highlighted by Mrs. Thompson as part of Amora's outstanding performance. Last week, Mrs. Thompson continued, Amora organized a study group for her classmates. She noticed that a few of them were struggling with multiplication, so she took the initiative to lead a small group. It was such a selfless act, and it shows the kind of person she is, always looking out for others while still excelling in her own work. The pride in Malik and Jasmine's hearts grew as Mrs. Thompson spoke. This was the kind of child they had always dreamed of raising, one who excelled academically and was a positive force in the classroom. It was clear that BMF Elementary, with its commitment to fostering leadership and creativity, was the ideal environment for their daughter. They listened intently as Mrs. Thompson recounted story after story about Amora's contributions to the class, from her academic successes to her role in helping other students succeed. There was no doubt in their minds that Amora had found a place where she could thrive. As the meeting drew to a close, Mrs. Thompson grew slightly misty-eyed. "I have to admit, I'm going to miss having Amora in my class," she said softly. "But I know she's ready for the next challenge. I have no doubt she'll continue to shine wherever she goes." The sentiment struck a chord with Malik and Jasmine, who were already thinking about what the next chapter would bring for their daughter. Just as they were about to wrap up, there was a knock at the door, and a new face entered the room. It was a woman with shoulder-length blonde hair and a friendly smile, who introduced herself as Susan Miller. "I hope I'm not interrupting," she said with a cheerful tone. "I heard the Westons were here, and I just had to introduce myself." Mrs. Thompson's face brightened at the sight of her colleague. "Perfect timing," she exclaimed. "Mr. and Mrs. Weston, this is Susan Miller. She'll be Amora's new teacher starting tomorrow." Susan Miller stepped forward with a firm handshake and a welcoming smile. "I've heard so many wonderful things about Amora," she said warmly. "Mrs. Thompson has been singing her praises in the teacher's lounge for months. I'm so excited to have such a bright, talented student in my class." Malik and Jasmine were immediately put at ease by Miller's genuine enthusiasm. She spoke confidently about her teaching philosophy and her plans for the upcoming term. "We'll be doing a lot of group projects," she said, "and I think Amora will thrive in that environment." Her leadership skills will really shine. The family felt a deep sense of relief, knowing that Amora was moving on to a teacher who appreciated her strengths and was eager to foster them. As the conversation came to an end, Mrs. Miller's parting words lingered in the air. "I just know we're going to have an amazing year together. I can't wait to see Amora tomorrow." Malik and Jasmine left the conference feeling optimistic about the future. They had found the perfect school, a place where Amora could excel academically and socially. The teachers were dedicated, the environment was nurturing, and Amora had a new teacher who was just as excited about her potential as they were. They couldn't have asked for more. The drive home that evening was filled with animated conversation as the Westons recounted everything they had learned about Amora's achievements. The pride they felt in their daughter was palpable. As they pulled into their driveway, the warm glow of their porch light welcomed them home, and Amora was waiting eagerly to hear all about the meeting. Little did they know that this evening, which had been filled with so much hope and excitement, was also the beginning of a series of events that would challenge everything they believed about the school they had entrusted with their daughter's future. The introduction of Susan Miller. As Malik and Jasmine Weston left the parent-teacher conference with Amora's current teacher, Mrs. Thompson, they couldn't help but feel reassured. The meeting had gone better than they could have imagined. Their daughter was excelling academically, and Mrs. Thompson had praised her for her leadership abilities, kindness, and determination. They were on cloud nine, feeling confident in their decision to move to this new neighborhood and enroll Amora at BMF Elementary. The school's commitment to academic excellence and inclusivity seemed to align perfectly with their hopes and values. But just as they thought the meeting was wrapping up, a new face entered the room, Susan Miller, the woman who would soon become Amora's new teacher. She entered with an air of ease and confidence, offering a warm smile and an enthusiastic greeting. Despite having never met her before, Malik and Jasmine immediately felt a sense of comfort from Mrs. Miller's presence. She carried herself with an approachable demeanor that reassured them, making the transition from Mrs. Thompson's class to her seem like a natural and exciting next step for their daughter. "I hope I'm not interrupting," Mrs. Miller said with a light laugh, her voice filled with warmth. "I heard the Westons were here, and I just had to introduce myself. I've heard such wonderful things about Amora." Her words immediately struck a chord with Malik and Jasmine. Mrs. Miller had heard of their daughter. This was a teacher who had already paid attention to the praise Amora had been receiving from her peers and teachers alike. That alone gave the Westons a sense of relief. They had heard good things about Mrs. Miller, and now, hearing it from her personally, made them feel even more at ease. "Oh, perfect timing." Mrs. Thompson chimed in, clearly pleased with the introduction. "Mr. and Mrs. Weston, this is Susan Miller. She'll be Amora's teacher starting tomorrow." Malik and Jasmine exchanged glances, both eager to meet the teacher who would guide Amora through the next academic chapter. Mrs. Miller was everything they could have hoped for. She radiated kindness and professionalism, and her enthusiasm for teaching was contagious. As she stepped forward, extending her hand to shake theirs, they were struck by how genuine she seemed. It wasn't just the usual scripted introduction that some teachers gave, it felt real, as though she truly cared about her students. "It's so exciting to meet you both," Mrs. Miller said, her smile warm and sincere. "Mrs. Thompson has been telling me all about Amora. She's such a bright and driven student. I can't wait to have her in my class. We're going to do some great things together." The Westons couldn't have asked for a more encouraging introduction. In that moment, they felt a deep sense of relief, knowing that Amora would be in the hands of someone who clearly understood her strengths and was excited to nurture them. Malik and Jasmine listened intently as Mrs. Miller described her teaching philosophy and what she had planned for the upcoming term. She spoke about fostering a collaborative classroom environment where each student's unique talents would be recognized and developed. "We'll be focusing a lot on group projects this term," Mrs. Miller explained. "And Amora's leadership skills are exactly what we need for these activities. I have no doubt she'll thrive in this kind of setting. I'm looking forward to seeing her step into that role and help guide her classmates." The mention of Amora's leadership abilities seemed to resonate with both Malik and Jasmine. As parents, they had always known that their daughter had a special gift for bringing people together and helping others excel. Whether it was in group work at school or leading family projects at home, Amora had always displayed a natural sense of responsibility and empathy toward others. To hear Mrs. Miller acknowledge these qualities and express such excitement about them made Malik and Jasmine feel confident that their daughter would be supported in every way possible in this new class. The conversation moved on, and Mrs. Miller continued to share her plans for the classroom. She mentioned how she believed in a hands-on, interactive approach to learning, where students would engage with the material rather than just absorb it passively. "It's important to make learning fun and exciting," she said, her eyes sparkling. "And with a student like Amora, I'm sure we're going to have a blast. She's one of those kids who can inspire the whole class just by being herself. To hear a teacher speak so positively about their daughter filled Malik and Jasmine with immense pride. The feeling that they had made the right decision about sending Amora to BMF Elementary only grew stronger in that moment. They were starting to see the fruits of their labor, their hard work, their sacrifices, their decision to move to a better neighborhood, all seemed to be paying off. Their daughter was not only being recognized for her academic potential but also for the unique qualities that made her such a wonderful person. As the meeting continued, Mrs. Miller spoke about the upcoming term, her enthusiasm for teaching evident in every word she said. She described the upcoming science experiments, the new reading material, and the interactive lessons that would allow the students to work together in creative ways. She even promised that Amora would be able to take part in some exciting field trips that would complement what they were learning in class. Each word from Mrs. Miller only deepened the Western's sense of optimism. But what really struck Malik and Jasmine was how much Mrs. Miller seemed to value Amora's ability to lead and take initiative. Her leadership qualities are exceptional, Mrs. Miller remarked. We'll be doing a lot of group projects, and I think she'll really thrive in that environment. It's rare to see a student so young take such ownership of a project. Amora is definitely a role model for her peers. At that moment, Malik and Jasmine couldn't have been more pleased. This was exactly the kind of teacher they had hoped Amora would have, a person who not only cared about her academic success but also valued her character and leadership skills. They were reassured that Amora was in good hands. As the meeting neared its end, Mrs. Miller's words were uplifting and encouraging, leaving the Westons feeling confident and excited for what the future would bring. I just know we're going to have an amazing year together, she said with a smile, her voice filled with certainty. I can't wait to see Amora tomorrow. I'm sure she's going to do incredible things in my class. The couple left the meeting feeling at peace, knowing they had made the right choice in moving to this progressive, inclusive community and entrusting their daughter to a teacher who genuinely cared about her success. Amora, it seemed, was going to be just fine here. The school was everything they had hoped for and more. Amora's unexplained behavior after the first day. The first day in Mrs. Miller's class had been a whirlwind of emotions for Amora. She had woken up excited and full of anticipation, eager to start a new chapter in her educational journey. The promise of engaging group projects and interactive lessons, as discussed by Mrs. Miller, had filled her with hope for the year ahead. Malik and Jasmine, too, were eager to hear all about their daughter's day, their minds filled with images of her walking through the door, bubbling with excitement, recounting every little detail of her first day. It was supposed to be the culmination of their decision to move to this new neighborhood and enroll her at BMF Elementary, a decision that seemed so right for their daughter's future. However, when the school day ended and Amora walked through the front door of their home, Malik and Jasmine were immediately struck by something that didn't feel right. Instead of bursting in with stories about her new classmates, her first group project, or what she had learned in science class, Amora walked in quietly. She didn't rush to hug her parents, nor did she express the excitement that had been typical of her in the past. There was a heaviness in her steps, her shoulders hunched, and her eyes seemed distant. For a moment, Malik and Jasmine exchanged a glance, a quiet moment of concern passing between them. Something was wrong. "Hey, sweetheart," Malik said gently, his voice full of warmth and encouragement. "How was your day? Did you enjoy your first day with Mrs. Miller?" Amora, without saying much, simply nodded and mumbled a soft, "It was fine." Her voice lacked its usual enthusiasm, and her eyes didn't sparkle with the excitement they were used to seeing after a long day at school. She didn't look up at them. Instead, she walked past her parents and headed straight toward her room. This was not typical of Amora, who usually couldn't wait to share the details of her day, whether it was the excitement of new lessons, the fun of playing with friends, or the pride in her academic achievements. Malik and Jasmine shared a brief look, a mix of confusion and concern. Was this just the nerves of starting a new school year catching up with her? Or was something more troubling happening? They decided to give Amora some space, not wanting to push her if she needed time to decompress. First days, after all, could be overwhelming, even for the most confident of students. The evening passed quietly, but an undercurrent of worry remained. Malik and Jasmine found themselves glancing toward the hallway, toward Amora's room, each time they heard her quiet movements. The typical sounds of her joy, whether she was playing with her toys, reading, or chatting with her parents about her day, were notably absent. Her silence seemed unusual, almost unnerving. They had always encouraged Amora to be open with them, to share her thoughts and feelings, no matter how small. But tonight, she seemed closed off, distant, and unwilling to talk. Around bedtime, Malik and Jasmine walked to Amora's room, both of them wondering whether the stress of a new school had simply taken its toll on her. When they opened the door, they found Amora lying on her bed, facing away from them. Her favorite stuffed elephant, Jenny, which she hadn't clung to in years, was held tightly in her arms. The sight of their 10-year-old daughter, normally so independent and confident, reverting to childhood behavior sent a wave of concern through both parents. She had always been such a resilient child, quick to adapt and eager to share her thoughts. But now, lying there with her stuffed animal in her arms, Amora seemed smaller, vulnerable, like someone who had been stripped of their confidence. Jasmine sat down gently on the edge of the bed, careful not to disturb Amora too much. She stroked her daughter's hair softly, speaking in a tone that was meant to soothe. "Sweetheart, what happened today? You seem different. Is everything okay?" Amora's shoulders tensed at her mother's touch, and she didn't respond immediately. There was an almost painful pause before she finally spoke, her voice muffled into her pillow. "It was just stressful," she muttered, as though the words were forced from her. She didn't meet her parents' eyes. The reluctance in her voice, the inability to articulate what was bothering her, made Malik's heart tighten in his chest. This was unlike Amora. She had always been open with them about her struggles, whether it was a hard math problem, a disagreement with a friend, or something else that weighed on her. But tonight, she seemed unwilling or unable to share her feelings. "Sweetheart, you can always tell us anything," Malik said, sitting down in the chair next to the bed, trying to make himself comfortable without crowding her. "What kind of stress? You don't have to go through anything alone. You know that, right?" For a moment, Amora said nothing. Then, she turned slightly toward them, just enough for them to see her tear-streaked face. Her eyes were red and puffy, as though she had been crying, something Malik and Jasmine rarely saw. Amora wasn't the type to cry easily. She was strong, confident, and usually the one comforting other children when they were upset. But now, she looked utterly defeated. Her voice trembled as she spoke. "I just want to be alone for a little while," she whispered. "Please." Malik and Jasmine exchanged a glance, both parents trying to make sense of what was happening. What had happened at school that would leave their daughter feeling this way? She had been so happy just the night before, so full of hope and excitement about starting the new school year. What could possibly have occurred during her first day in Mrs. Miller's class that had led to this drastic shift in behavior? "I understand," Jasmine said softly, brushing a few strands of hair from Amora's face. "If you need space, we'll give you time. But we're always here when you're ready to talk, okay?" Amora nodded, her face still turned away, the tears now silently streaming down her cheeks. The quietness in the room was deafening. Neither parent knew what to do. They had hoped this would be a smooth transition, a fresh start for their daughter, but the unease in her behavior suggested that something wasn't quite right. After a few moments, Jasmine and Malik left the room, leaving Amora alone to process whatever was weighing on her. Both parents stood in the hallway for a moment, unsure of how to proceed. Should they press her for answers, or was this just a sign of first-day nerves? But deep down, they knew that Amora wasn't just feeling nervous. Something had changed in her that day, something they couldn't yet put their fingers on. The night wore on, but the unease in the air between Malik and Jasmine only grew. They both tried to focus on the tasks at hand, preparing dinner, tidying up, but their minds kept drifting back to Amora, to the way she had acted. This wasn't the same vibrant, outgoing child they had dropped off at school that morning. The next morning would reveal more, but Malik and Jasmine couldn't shake the feeling that something had happened that had caused their daughter to retreat into herself. The discovery in the school cafeteria. The following day was filled with uncertainty. Despite his initial reassurance to himself that Amora's behavior was simply a product of the first-day jitters, Malik couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. There was an instinct deep within him, honed over years of being a protective father, that told him this wasn't just normal school stress. Amora was too composed, too responsible, to let something as trivial as a new class disrupt her entire demeanor in such a profound way. Her withdrawal, her inability to open up, and the strange silence that had filled their house the previous night told him that something deeper was at play. Malik had been there before, when Amora had been bullied at her old school, and he could feel a familiar unease settling in his chest. The night had been long for both Malik and Jasmine. They spent hours in quiet contemplation, each of them wondering what had happened to cause this sudden change in their daughter. They had reassured themselves that Amora would talk when she was ready, but the gnawing sense of worry wouldn't leave. It was that very sense of worry that drove Malik to make an unusual decision the next morning. He wasn't going to let this go. He couldn't wait for Amora to come to them with the truth. He needed to know what had happened at school that had caused such a stark shift in her behavior. As much as he wanted to respect her space, His protective instincts were screaming that something was terribly wrong. Malik decided that he would observe. He would take the day off work, not as a way to interfere with Amora's privacy, but as a means of understanding what was happening. He didn't tell Jasmine about his decision. He simply informed her that he would be taking Amora to school that morning, wanting to offer her a bit of extra support after her difficult first day. Jasmine, thinking it was a thoughtful gesture, didn't question him. She kissed Amora goodbye, sending her off with her father as the school bus drove away. The drive to school that morning was filled with a tense silence. Amora was quieter than usual, her eyes fixed on the passing scenery outside the window, her fingers nervously tapping the strap of her backpack. It wasn't like her to be so withdrawn, especially not in the presence of her father, with whom she typically had such a warm and open relationship. Malik, sensing the change in her, did his best to engage her in conversation, asking her how she was feeling and if she was looking forward to her second day with Mrs. Miller. But Amora barely responded. Her answers were short, her tone flat, and her gaze never met Malik's. The only hint of emotion came when she glanced toward the school, her body stiffening ever so slightly, as if she were bracing herself for something she didn't want to face. Malik's heart sank. He had no idea what was happening, but he could sense that whatever it was much bigger than he had first imagined. At the school drop-off, Amora gave Malik a quick, quiet hug before she walked toward the entrance. There was no excited wave, no skipping step, no joy in her movements. Just a reluctant acceptance of the day ahead. She hesitated at the entrance for a moment, looking back at her father, but then turned and walked inside, her small figure disappearing into the building. Malik stood there for a moment, watching her, his mind racing. What had changed? Why was his daughter, who had always been so confident, so eager, now so withdrawn and distant? It wasn't like her to act this way, and it filled Malik with an overwhelming sense of dread. He stayed in the parking lot, watching the school building for any sign of what might be troubling Amora. He had a clear view of the playground and the cafeteria from where he parked, and his intention was simple: observe and gather information. Perhaps he could catch a glimpse of something, an interaction, a subtle sign, that might explain the shift in Amora's behavior. He wasn't sure what he was looking for, but his gut told him that whatever was troubling Amora wasn't something she could explain to him yet. As the morning passed slowly, Malik kept a close watch on the school. He observed the students during recess, seeing Amora with a group of her friends. At first, it seemed like everything was fine. She was smiling, laughing, and playing with her friends just as she had on the first day. She even seemed to be enjoying a game of jump rope with two of the other girls. But as Malik watched more closely, he noticed something that gave him pause. Amora's laughter seemed to fade too quickly, and her eyes kept darting nervously toward the school building. She stayed closer to the edges of the playground, away from the larger groups of children in the center. It was subtle, but Malik's instincts told him that Amora was withdrawing, not because of the other children, but because of something inside the school. Something had her on edge. His suspicions grew as the morning wore on. There were no obvious signs of bullying or mistreatment from the other students. In fact, it seemed like Amora's classmates were drawn to her just as they had been described by Mrs. Thompson. Amora was well liked, and her classmates seemed to enjoy her company. But something still felt off. At lunchtime, Malik's unease deepened. He remembered the strange behavior from the night before, the way Amora had eaten as if she hadn't seen food all day. Was she not eating enough at lunch? Or perhaps was there something happening during lunch that she hadn't told him about? Was she being bullied again, but this time, in a way that was more difficult to detect? As the bell rang for the second lunch period, Malik positioned himself so that he could see the cafeteria doors. He watched as the children filed in, each of them chatting excitedly about their meal. It was a routine he had observed countless times during his own school days, and it seemed nothing out of the ordinary at first. But then he spotted Amora. She walked into the cafeteria with her classmates, but something about her demeanor struck him as wrong. She wasn't engaging with the other children. She walked with her head down, keeping her distance from the group. The most unsettling part came when Amora reached the front of the lunch line. Malik watched as Mrs. Miller, out of nowhere, appeared behind the counter, speaking quietly to the lunch staff, who looked confused. Then, Mrs. Miller smiled, a cold, unsettling smile that didn't reach her eyes, and personally served something onto Amora's tray. Malik's heart stopped as he saw what was placed before his daughter. It was not the usual cafeteria meal, a tray of spaghetti, salad, or a sandwich. Instead, there, in the center of the tray, was something that made his stomach turn: a fried frog. Not a French fry, not a chicken nugget, but an actual frog, its legs splayed grotesquely across the tray. Malik felt his hands begin to shake as he realized what he was witnessing. His daughter, his little girl, had been given this disgusting meal, and worse still, Mrs. Miller had handed it to her personally. Unable to stand it any longer, Malik rushed into the cafeteria. The sight of Amora sitting alone at a table, her head bowed, staring at the food she couldn't bring herself to eat, made his blood boil. His voice shook with barely contained anger as he called out her name, Amora. At the sound of his voice, Amora's head snapped up, and for a brief moment, Malik saw the fear in her eyes. Not the fear of being found by her father, but the fear of being caught in this horrible situation. Her face crumpled, and she ran to him, throwing her arms around his waist as if he were the only thing that could shield her from the nightmare she had endured. "Baby, what happened?" Malik asked, his voice trembling. He could feel her small body shaking against him as she clung to him. Amora's voice was barely a whisper, but the words that came next shattered everything Malik thought he knew about the school they had chosen for her. "Mrs. Miller," Amora said, her voice trembling, "she said this is what our kind eats." The words hit Malik like a punch to the gut. In that moment, everything, the reassuring meetings, the promising environment, the sense of security they had worked so hard to build, crumbled. His daughter had just been subjected to an act of racism so blatant, so cruel, that it took his breath away. And it had come not from a student, but from a teacher, the one person who was supposed to nurture, protect, and guide his daughter. Malik's hands shook as he looked at the frog on the tray. He couldn't understand how something like this could happen at BMF Elementary, a school they had chosen because of its progressive, inclusive environment. The reality of the situation hit him full force. Their daughter had been subjected to this treatment not just once, but for 2 days, suffering in silence, just as she had at her old school. Confrontation and arrest of Mrs. Miller. Malik's mind raced as he held Amora tightly, her small body trembling in his arms. The shock of hearing what had happened to her, the disbelief that it had come from a teacher, someone who was supposed to care for and nurture her, left him reeling. The cafeteria had gone eerily silent, and Malik felt the weight of 1,000 eyes on him as he processed the horror of what had just occurred. The frog on the tray, Amora's tear-streaked face, and the cruel words from Mrs. Miller echoed in his mind. It was as if everything he thought he knew about the safe, inclusive environment of BMF Elementary had been shattered in an instant. Amora clung to him desperately, the shock of what had happened overwhelming her. Malik's protective instincts flared, his anger rising as he realized that his daughter had been subjected to such an atrocious act, not from a peer, but from an authority figure. His fingers tightened around her as he gently reassured her. "It's okay, baby. I'm here now. Nothing's going to hurt you anymore." As he spoke, Malik's eyes scanned the room. The other students in the cafeteria were still staring, some with confusion, others with guilt. Some had pulled out their phones, no doubt recording the entire scene. While he couldn't help but feel a sense of betrayal at the situation, he also knew that this evidence would be critical in ensuring that the teacher responsible faced consequences for her actions. He took a deep breath, steeling himself for the next step. What he was about to do would forever change the course of events at the school. He didn't hesitate. He pulled out his phone, dialing 911 with trembling fingers. The operator picked up, her voice calm and professional. Malik could barely keep his own voice steady as he spoke, his words thick with anger and heartbreak. "I need to report a hate crime at BMF Elementary," he said. "A teacher is deliberately serving my black daughter inedible food and making racist comments. I need officers here immediately." The words felt surreal coming out of his mouth, but there was no doubt in his mind that this was a hate crime, an act of racism so blatant and calculated that it demanded immediate action. The operator acknowledged the seriousness of the situation, confirming that officers were being dispatched to the school. "Please stay where you are, sir. Officers will arrive shortly." As Malik ended the call, he looked down at Amora, her small form still clinging to him, her eyes wide with fear. He could feel her trembling, but he also saw a flicker of something else, relief. She had been so quiet, so withdrawn for the past day and night, but now that she was in his arms, she seemed to draw strength from his presence. Malik kissed her forehead gently, trying to steady his own shaking hands. "You're safe now, baby," he whispered. "I'm not going anywhere. We'll make sure this is all fixed, okay?" Malik stood up, holding Amora protectively by his side. The cafeteria was still quiet, the tension thick in the air. Mrs. Miller was nowhere to be found, but Malik wasn't going to let her slip away. Not after what she had done. He turned to the nearest teacher, a woman who had been watching the scene unfold with wide eyes. "Where's Mrs. Miller?" he demanded, his voice low but filled with authority. "I need to speak with her now." The teacher stammered, unsure of how to respond, But just then, the door to the cafeteria opened. Principal Roberts entered, his face grave as he took in the situation. Malik wasted no time. He stormed over to him, his voice shaking with barely controlled rage. "Principal Roberts, I need to speak with you immediately. You need to remove Mrs. Miller from this school right now. She's the one who did this to my daughter." Roberts, taken aback by the intensity in Malik's voice, raised his hands in a gesture of calm. "Mr. Weston, I understand you're upset." "Upset?" Malik cut him off, his voice rising. "You should be furious, too. Your teacher just subjected my daughter to something so vile, so racist, and you're standing here, acting like it's just another incident. I need to speak to Mrs. Miller, and I need to make sure she's held accountable for this." Just then, Mrs. Miller appeared in the doorway, her face ashen, her usual calm demeanor gone. She looked at Malik, her expression distant and detached, as though nothing was out of the ordinary. But her gaze faltered when she saw the anger in Malik's eyes. "Mr. Weston," she said coldly, her voice dripping with false sincerity, "I'm sure this is all a misunderstanding. I don't know what you're talking about." She stepped forward, brushing past Principal Roberts and toward Malik. "This is ridiculous. I think we should all just—" "No," Malik interrupted, stepping forward and blocking her path. "I don't want to hear your excuses. I want to know why you did this to my daughter. Why did you serve her that frog? Why did you tell her that it was something her kind eats? What kind of teacher does that?" For the first time, Mrs. Miller's composure wavered. A faint smirk appeared on her face, but it was one filled with contempt. "Mr. Weston," she said, her voice dripping with venom, "I'm sure this is just an overreaction. I didn't mean anything by it. Your daughter has been sensitive. It was just a little joke." "A joke?" Malik's voice cracked with disbelief. "You think this is a joke? You think telling my daughter that she deserves to eat that disgusting thing is funny? You think you can get away with it because of your little jokes? No, I'm done. You are a disgrace to that school, and you're going to face the consequences for your actions." Before Mrs. Miller could respond, the door to the cafeteria opened again, this time with two police officers entering the room. The officers, one older and one younger, surveyed the scene, their eyes taking in the tense atmosphere. The older officer, with graying hair, stepped forward first. "Mr. Weston," he said, his voice calm but firm, "I'm Officer Harris. We received your call about a potential hate crime. Can you tell us what happened?" Malik didn't hesitate. He recounted everything that had occurred, from Amora's change in behavior the day before to the discovery of the frog in the cafeteria. As he spoke, Mrs. Miller's face grew pale. Her smug expression faded, replaced by something closer to guilt, but it was too late. Malik had the evidence. He had seen it with his own eyes, and now the police were here to ensure justice would be served. "Officer Harris, I need you to look at that tray," Malik said, pointing toward the lunch table. The tray was still sitting there, the fried frog untouched, a grotesque reminder of what had happened. Officer Harris nodded and approached the table, taking photos of the evidence. "This is unacceptable," Officer Harris muttered as he took in the sight of the disgusting meal. "We're going to need to speak to the cafeteria staff, and we'll need to check the security footage from today." He turned to the younger officer. "Call for backup. We need to get statements from any students who witnessed this." Within minutes, the officers had secured the scene. Mrs. Miller's usual cold demeanor had evaporated completely, replaced by a flicker of panic. She knew the game was up. Officer Harris turned to her and, with a grim look, said, "Mrs. Miller, you're under arrest for committing a hate crime against this child. You have the right to remain silent." Mrs. Miller's facade cracked as she was led away in handcuffs. She began protesting loudly, trying to maintain an air of innocence, but her protests fell on deaf ears. As she was escorted out of the cafeteria, Malik couldn't help but feel a wave of mixed emotions. There was relief that justice would be done, but also a profound sadness that such hatred could exist in a place that was supposed to be safe for children. Amora, still shaken, stood by Malik's side, her body still trembling. But there was a spark of something else in her eyes now. A sense of empowerment. She wasn't alone anymore. She had a father who would move mountains to protect her, and now, there was evidence that would ensure that Mrs. Miller would never hurt anyone again. Malik led Amora out of the cafeteria, his heart heavy with the weight of what had transpired. But as he looked at his daughter, he felt a renewed sense of determination. This wasn't over. There was still much to be done, but they would face it together. No one would ever hurt Amora again. The drive home from BMF Elementary was quiet. The weight of the events that had transpired in the cafeteria hung heavy in the air, settling like an unshakable fog around the Weston family. Malik, still in shock, glanced at his daughter in the passenger seat. Amora, wrapped in the emergency blanket he had retrieved from the trunk, was no longer shaking, but her face was pale and her eyes seemed far away. She stared out of the window, lost in thought, perhaps still processing the trauma she had just endured. Malik kept his hands on the steering wheel, trying to steady his own racing thoughts. He couldn't help but replay every detail of the confrontation in the cafeteria. The horror of seeing his daughter served a grotesque meal by Mrs. Miller, her tearful revelation about the teacher's words, and the moment when the police arrived. The moment of victory, when Mrs. Miller was arrested and led out of the building, was a turning point. But even as he felt a sense of relief knowing that justice would be done, he couldn't escape the deep sadness that this kind of hatred still existed, even in a place where children should have been safe. As they pulled into the driveway, Jasmine was already waiting outside, her expression a mixture of worry and anger. She had been on edge all day, unable to shake the feeling that something was wrong, but now that Malik and Amora were home, the weight of the situation hit her all over again. Amora, who had been through so much, finally saw her mother and ran to her, letting out all the tears she had been holding back. Jasmine enveloped her daughter in a tight embrace, her own eyes welling up with tears. Malik stood at the door, watching his family, his heart heavy but full of resolve. This was far from over. The fight for justice was only beginning, and while today had been a victory, Mrs. Miller had been arrested and removed from her position, there were still legal battles ahead. There would be questions from the school, the district, and the community. But above all, there would be a long road ahead in helping Amora heal from this painful experience. Later that evening, after Amora had finally calmed down and gone to bed, Malik and Jasmine sat together in the kitchen. They shared a pot of tea, but neither of them had the stomach for the comforting ritual. Their cups grew cold as they discussed what had happened, what it meant for their family, and how they would move forward. "I can't believe this happened here," Jasmine said, her voice hollow with disbelief. She sat back in her chair, staring down at the table. "We thought we had found somewhere safe for her. Somewhere better. How could this happen in a place like this?" Malik leaned forward, his elbows resting on the table. "I don't know, Jasmine. I don't know how it happens, but it does. We can't live in a bubble, no matter how perfect everything seems. People like Mrs. Miller exist in places we never expect." His voice faltered, but he quickly recovered. "But that doesn't mean we stop fighting. We fight for Amora. We fight for other kids like her. We don't let them win." Jasmine nodded, wiping a tear from her cheek. She reached for Malik's hand, squeezing it tightly. "What do we do now? How do we help her move on from this?" "We show her that she's stronger than their hatred," Malik replied, his voice firm but gentle. "We show her that she is loved and worthy of respect, exactly as she is. We help her heal, and we make sure this never happens again." He paused, looking at Jasmine. "And we don't let her forget that she's not alone in this. We fight for her, together. We make sure she knows she has our love and our support, no matter what." The two of them sat in silence for a while, the weight of the evening slowly beginning to settle into a new resolve. This wasn't just about protecting Amora from harm, it was about making sure that no child would ever face this kind of trauma again. They had made the decision to move here for a fresh start, to give Amora a better life. And while their faith in the school had been shaken, their determination to fight for what was right had only grown stronger. In the days that followed, Malik and Jasmine worked tirelessly to ensure that justice would be done. The school district launched an investigation into Mrs. Miller's actions, and the community rallied behind the Weston family. The story of Amora's experience spread quickly, sparking outrage and calls for accountability. Malik and Jasmine met with school officials, district representatives, and even local activists who supported their cause. They knew that there were still many battles ahead, legal, emotional, and social, but they were ready to face them all. Amora, for her part, slowly began to open up. The healing process was long, and there were days when the weight of what had happened seemed too much for her to bear. But each day, she grew stronger. She spent time with her parents, talking about her feelings and fears, and slowly, she found comfort in knowing that the people who loved her would always stand by her. The road to recovery wasn't easy, but with the support of her parents, the community, and even her friends at school, Amora began to rebuild the trust and confidence that had been shattered by Mrs. Miller's cruelty. In the end, the Westons' fight for justice was not just about holding one teacher accountable, it was about showing Amora that no one could define her by the color of her skin or the hatred of others. It was about teaching her that, no matter the obstacles, she would always have a voice and a family that would fight for her. Most importantly, It was about ensuring that she would never have to face this kind of injustice again. As Malik and Jasmine sat in their living room, watching Amora as she played with her favorite stuffed animal, they knew the battle had been hard, but it was worth it. They had come through it stronger than ever, and they would continue to fight for a world where their daughter, and every child, could live without fear of hatred or prejudice. They had fought for Amora, and they would keep fighting, for her, and for every child who deserved to live in a world where love and respect were the only things that mattered.